first question I have for the panelists, which I hope is just an opportunity for you to learn more about the work that they all do, and I'm going to give them 3 or 5 minutes to answer before going into follow-up questions, is to ask them to talk about a project or initiative that you are most proud of or excited by. And let's start with Thomas.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me here. It's really an exciting opportunity for me to hear from you all and learn from you all about all of the great work that you are doing, and hopefully share a little bit about the work that we do at the Center for Community Investment and my personal experience in community development. If I could just briefly let you know a little bit about the Center for Community Investment and the work that we do. So, we work to overcome disinvestment and improve opportunity so that everyone has a fair chance to lead a healthy and productive life. So what we do with our sort of systems framework, we help communities set the stage for investments. We start with local priorities that local leaders make visible. We also work with those leaders to develop a pipeline of investments. And then we think about the enabling environment in that local community that enables investments to in new dollars to be unlocked, new partnerships to be unlocked, streamline the system of investment, sort of whatever the challenges or barriers to investing in community priorities might be. We work with leaders and collaboratives with our framework and our tools. And I came to the Center for Community Investment just last year, and I wanted to just share one example from my past work and then one example from my current work in the city of San Bernardino, supporting a local team there. And I promise to do it in the time limit. One of the things that I'm most proud of from my time at the Little Tokyo Service Center Community Development Corporation, they are a nonprofit social service and community development organization in the Little Tokyo neighborhood of Los Angeles. And so Little Tokyo is this historic ethnic enclave, sort of a gateway community for new immigrants. It's also very multi-ethnic. It has a historic district that's federally protected. And one of the big issues that was impacting the community while I was had the good fortune of working there and with the community is the construction of light rail, which sparked this whole light rail station, which sparked a whole conversation about, what's the future of the neighborhood, what's the potential for not just development, but also gentrification and displacement. And this is a neighborhood that's seen many, many waves of displacement over, over a century of history. And I was one of a number of leaders that got together to envision our own concept of sustainability that was culturally relevant for the Japanese American and the broader stakeholders that called Little Tokyo home in different ways, that was respectful of small business while looking ahead to attract a kind of new development that communities were interested in. And redefine climate goals and environmental justice from a place that sort of resonated with people's daily lived experience and their cultural values. So that was a really fun project that still continues to this day, that was really energized by creative artists and cultural practitioners. It was a really collaborative process. Right now, what's really inspiring is the work in San Bernardino that I have the privilege to support as a CCI advisor. They are working in a really challenging ecosystem, not only the current COVID crisis, but also a city that has faced and come out of bankruptcy. Long history of disinvestment. They've managed, in working with CCI, to see a pipeline of developments, including home ownership, new multifamily development, and what we've done is help them see what's the first batch of investable deals, and their local hospitals. Dignity Common Spirit is stepping up with investment. We're hoping to match that with foundation PRI investment. And all of that is with the goal of, they've identified, I think it's 8,000 units in 10 years as their overall housing goal. So, a hugely ambitious housing goal, but much needed. Across the state, similar to communities across the state. And so just being able to persist through such a crisis, multiple crises that we are today, has just been really inspiring.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm now, just because of what you touched on at the end, I wanted to turn it over to Araceli to talk about some of the exciting work that she's been doing in the Coachella Valley.
Well, thank you, Sunita. And I was clapping there for Thomas. I see what you did there, because we are a site for the Center for Community Investment work. And so the framework that Thomas described is really the framework that has guided the work that I'll be sharing. So really great to follow kind of what he shared with us. So Live to Rise is a cross-sector, community-driven partnership, and really what our work is about is reimagining how we change the trajectory of opportunity for families in the Coachella Valley. We know that in the Coachella Valley, like many places throughout California, affordable housing, or the lack of affordable housing, is the primary driver of instability for families. For those who aren't familiar with the Coachella Valley, we are 60% of our population are rent burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income on rent. And what makes it unique here, and why we look at rent burden in our area, is because it's a really important measure of affordability and economic vulnerability for our residents. Folks in the region, their wages are really, really low. And over the past, when you look at data over the past, I want to say 8 years, the total median household income has actually been declining, while rent burden has stayed steady, if not increasing. So for us, the rent burden as an indicator really kind of is the metric of our work. And so the work of Live to Rise is really about convening partners, community organizations, developers, cities, financial institutions around a goal to reduce rent burden by increasing the supply of affordable housing over the next 10 years. So we hold a three-pronged housing agenda along pipeline, which Thomas described, policy and investment, to really think about how we organize ourselves locally and have a level of coordination to really draw down investment. And as part of that work, I guess one of the things I'll answer what we're most proud of, and then what we're really excited about. What we're most proud of is the level of partnership that we've been able to build within that framework and towards that goal. And so we were with CCI for 2 years doing this internal capacity building, but really this work has taken like 5 years. I think if you ask our founder and CEO, she'll tell you it's been more than that, because it's been about kind of building those relationships that will sustain the work, and building those partnerships that will allow for the work to happen. And so I'm really proud of coming into this work at a place where there was a little bit of tension in the partnership, because it allowed me to see kind of what it takes to get to the place where we're at now. And now to what we're most excited about is the launch of our Housing Catalyst Fund, which is set to launch January of 2021. And that would not have been possible had it not been for the work that we've done in aggregating a pipeline of investable deals, doing tons of community listening, really creating those spaces where collaboration and coordination among the cities can occur. So we're really excited to be sharing that. We're going to announce in January the launch of the fund, and the work between now and then is really about vetting some of those deals for investment to go into those projects. And what makes this so catalytic is that the projects have been identified together as a collaborative, as a network of organizations with community partners who have said that, you know, folks want options. So anything from Polanco parks for our farm working communities to permanent supportive housing to the first multifamily project in places like Indian Wells, where there's never been affordable multifamily projects. The batch is really catalytic. And so we've been able to transform the work, transform partners, and we're really excited about where we're at. All while, you know, COVID is still happening, we're still believing that, you know, all of this work is still possible. So even though the pace has slowed down a little bit for things out of our control, we're still kind of pushing and paving the pavement so that we can continue to advance our housing agenda.
Thank you, Araceli. That was great. And one of the things that you mentioned is thinking about options. So I wanted to turn it over to Zachary Murray, and I had a blank when I was introducing him, but I first became familiar with his work when he was at Grounded Solutions, and he worked on a policy toolkit for inclusive growth. But now I will turn it over to him.
Great, thank you, Sunita. And as you mentioned, I work in the space of community land trusts. I'm a consultant and previously was a program manager at the Oakland Community Land Trust. And that work is what I'm most, to give just a little bit of background. So I worked at Grounded Solutions Network, which is a national technical assistance and capacity building organization for community land trusts, community development organizations, and inclusionary housing practitioners. And then also did some research at the Green Lining Institute as a fellow there on the issues of access to credit and home lending in communities in California, including Fresno and Oakland. And at OCLT, Oakland Community Land Trust, what I'm most proud of is our work there to build, to meet a really critical community need, and that is for affordable housing preservation ecosystem. And so we had in Oakland a very specific dynamic of gentrification and displacement that is induced by that. And so a lot of research has been done over the years by groups including the Urban Strategies Council and OCLT to look into what are the drivers of that displacement. And what OCLT found specifically was that 88% of Oakland's housing is small site, meaning it's buildings that are under 25 units. And so that created a huge displacement risk because the majority of these buildings, the majority of these units don't qualify for tax credit funding. And so they don't have access to what is the primary source for preservation. And so in identifying that challenge that we have single family homes, we have duplexes, triplexes, and really small 8-unit apartment buildings consistently across our city, that there needed to be some kind of a system built and mechanisms developed to help meet this very specific need in the absence of large federal and state subsidy sources. And so in building that ecosystem, it required us to collaborate with the larger community development organizations that do work in the LIHTC space, but have access to credit, have developer experience, and to build out connections that ensure that as properties are becoming available, there's triage happening where developers, affordable developers, are getting information about these properties proactively, whether it's from the tenants through tenant organizing organizations, or through our knowledge and connections to MLS or different resources. And so in doing that, we also, as a part of that ecosystem, the first part being the connection between development groups and tenant organizations, also focused on policy. And so building out enabling policies and regulations that help to ensure that our housing department and that the county and other actors are really moving and enabling preservation to take place. And finally, as a part of that ecosystem is building up the finance and ensuring that lenders are aware of the need, that there is ample subsidy being created or made available, and also that there are grant resources that help to meet the specific mission that CLTs do in terms of providing affordable ownership access. And so PRI from foundations becomes a critical mechanism for that. And in terms of the policies, we were able to introduce the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act here in Oakland, which will be legislated hopefully over the coming months. And that provides, in that 88% small site housing stock, but throughout our housing stock in the city of Oakland, tenants with the first right of refusal to purchase their properties at the point of sale. And we believe that that's a really critical tool in a space where there's limited subsidy, but also really strong displacement pressures to help at least delay, but also move more of those properties into our awareness so that we can preserve them. And you know, the community land trusts, which I hope we can talk a little bit more about at some point, is really a ladder to ownership. It expands access. It expands the very types of mechanisms that we have as a community to provide housing to people. It ensures that folks have access to building equity, but it's also available in perpetuity, meaning when one household benefits and moves on, the next household that is in need and low income has access to the same resource. And I think the efficiency there is really important, as we know in California that construction costs are high and the subsidies are not really as available as they need to be. And so finally, just to close, I want to highlight one of the really amazing efforts in that ecosystem that we've been developing in Oakland, Moms for Housing, who worked in partnership with the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, OCLT, and the city government, to acquire a property in West Oakland. You know, the displacement pressure because of the small site housing stock has created a lot of investor activity from outside investors who are sitting on many of the properties as vacant for a number of years or overcharging residents. And so Wedgwood, who was an investor who was doing this, not only agreed to sell the property to Moms for Housing and the Oakland Community Land Trust so that it could be a permanent sanctuary for homeless families, but has also agreed to make its portfolio available in a first right of refusal to OCLT and other nonprofit developers. And so I think there's really a lot that can be done when we map out and really develop the ecosystem. And I'm really proud of that work that we've been able to accomplish in Oakland.
Thank you, Zachary. That was great. And one of the things that you mentioned is thinking about the ladder to ownership and the varieties and ways in which folks can be thinking about economic stability and opportunity. I think is a great segue to Rudy Espinoza to talk about your work. So I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hey, everybody. Is everybody doing okay? Thumbs up. I see Daryl Rutherford. Hey, Daryl, I met you in Stockton, dude. What's up?
Nice to see you
Stockton
too.
in the house.
Yeah.
I'm so happy to be here. I work in Los Angeles. I work in a CDFI that's called Inclusive Action for the City. And I'll be brief with the work that we do because I really want to hear from you all. Inclusive Action does two things. The first thing that we do is we do policy advocacy. We do policy advocacy around economic development and economic opportunity. And the reason why we do that is because we believe the systems that currently exist are not working for our neighborhoods. The laws that are currently in place are not serving us. And so we need to do research and work with our elected leaders to change these systems. That's a really key important thing. One of the biggest efforts that we've done in the last 10 years has been the effort to legalize street vending in Los Angeles. We've seen thousands of entrepreneurs in our community, in our city, being criminalized for trying to take care of their families. And so we were successful in 2018 in not only legalizing vending in LA, but passing a statewide bill, Senate Bill 946, to decriminalize street vending throughout the state. And so that's really key. But as folks that, and we're working on a variety of other things that I'm happy to talk about currently right now with this pandemic that relate to housing, that relate to small business development. But street vending is one of the higher profile campaigns that we've worked on to date. But you all probably are aware that sometimes passing laws is not enough. We also have to think about how money moves in our neighborhoods or how it doesn't move. And Zachary's work and everybody else's work around housing and exploring land trusts and even activist initiatives like Moms for Housing that has inspired people all over the country are really important examples of how we can connect advocacy and policy change to economic development. And that is really the second division of Inclusive Action is we administer economic development programs. We are a lender that provides access to capital to small businesses that can't get capital elsewhere. We have a loan fund that provides low interest loans to entrepreneurs like street vendors and other businesses in the informal or on the fringes of the formal economy that can't go to a bank or may not even be able to get a loan from another CDFI. They come to us and we offer capital and we offer coaching to support them. The other project that I'll share with you, which is for the team that I was with in my breakout group, I was really interested in commercial real estate because a couple of years ago, we began to work and partner with a couple of other organizations here in LA to acquire commercial real estate in neighborhoods that are changing in our city. So last year, we were able to close on the acquisition of 5 commercial buildings on the east side of LA in neighborhoods that are changing, with the intention of taking properties off the speculative market to preserve the small businesses that are there. And so as you all see in our cities, sometimes the businesses in our communities are the first to go in a neighborhood that's changing, in a neighborhood that is being impacted by gentrification. And the reason why is because a lot of our businesses don't have long-term leases. And as Zach just mentioned, they do not own. We do not own land as we should. And so we are actively working and thinking about how do we leverage the tools at our disposal to acquire buildings and help people build equity and build wealth. So I'll end there. But I know that we've been thinking about what inspires us during this time in this pandemic. And what I shared with my breakout group is that I'm really inspired by the creativity that is here and the willingness to try things that people have told us that were never possible. Before March, our leaders were telling us that it's not possible to give grants to small businesses, that it's not possible to administer cash relief efforts, that it's not possible to take public buildings and house people. They were telling us that it wasn't possible, and literally in a couple of weeks, it was possible. So it expands. I hope, at least for me, it expanded our ambitions for what we could do and what the future is for us. I hope beyond this pandemic, because I think none of us want to go back to the way it was. We really want to get to a just recovery, and we really want to see economic justice in our community. So I'm here to support you all. I love talking about these things. So that's why I'm going to pause and kick it back to Sunita.
Thank you, Rudy. And we are going to open it up for questions after our final presenter, last but definitely not least. And I think I had a feeling that Rudy might talk about the commercial real estate. And I think Alondra can speak to that. And of the panelists, she's the one who's based in Fresno. So I will pass it over to you, Alondra.
Shoot, I don't know about coming up after Rudy. I'm sitting up here like, keep talking. So he talks about a lot of stuff that I'm passionate about. I'm just like, wow, I want to be in your group, your breakout group. Everybody, let's join groups. Anyway, I'm Alondra Williams, the Fresno Regional Manager for Community Vision. We are also a CDFI. And we have an initiative right now that actually was launched, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, called the Black Liberation Initiative. One of the things that we focus on is to bring equity in lending and resources, or access to resources, to BIPOC-led organizations, nonprofits, and also we are, because of the pandemic, have shifted a lot of our focus to small businesses and micro businesses. And while we actually, our largest, or our smallest loan is about $50,000, and we go up to, I think it's $750,000. With everything that's going on right now, we've started kind of shifting to where we can sub-grant to some of our, or sub-lend to some of our external partners, so that we can provide that assistance that is so vitally important to BIPOC-led organizations. And just so I'm not talking over anybody's head, I'm pretty sure you guys have heard BIPOC before, but it is Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And so those are the focus groups that we look to support. And one of the things that I'm working on right now is an initiative that is a branch off, because we're based in the Bay Area, specifically San Francisco, but we have a Real People's group a Real People's Fund, sorry, that is a branch off of the Black Liberation Initiative there. And in the Central Valley, we have Invest Black Central Valley. Those are some of the things that I'm really excited to work on right now. And going into the commercial space, my background is also in pre-development and construction, and I also worked at the city of Fresno in their planning department. So having that knowledge and then coming into this space and seeing how vitally important it is for our BIPOC-led organizations to understand pre-development and construction, which we're finding that there's a severe gap in that understanding, so that they can acquire a commercial space or even go into land ownership, which we know is one of the vital components in wealth building, which is another thing that I'm really excited to help people accomplish and realize. We found that a lot of our clients are, they just don't understand how the construction world flows into the government world. And going into that space, you also are exposed to how different policies have been set in place to marginalize and further restrict people of color from land ownership, wealth building, and other resources that are necessary for wealth building. So one of the things that I'm really excited about is Invest Black Central Valley, and just being able to provide those resources to people groups that don't normally have those resources because of different policies that have been in place to keep them in a form of captivity and oppression. So super excited to, carry on this conversation. Super excited to hear back from a lot of the other panelists, looking into trying to figure out how we can work in this new space. And to Rudy's point, having been told what we cannot do because of things that were set in place, and the people who have power like to retain that power, but being able to shift and make systemic change that's going to be permanent change and propel us into a future that's more equitable for everyone. That's what's really exciting for me right now. And I'm going to yield the floor back to Sunita. Thank you.
Thank you, Alondra. So I hope that those comments made it clear why we asked these folks to present. What we are going to have breakout conversations, and I had some follow-up questions planned, but I actually think what I'd like to do is just open it up to folks to see if you all have questions that you want to ask. And we'll take about 3, maybe 4 questions, and then give the panelists a chance to jump in on whichever question they feel like they want to respond to. Ooh. Allison, can you unmute?
You want me to unmute everybody?
Oh, do people have the capacity to unmute themselves?
They should, yeah. Go ahead and unmute yourself, or you can throw a question into the comments, either one. If there was something that was just confusing, like an acronym, or folks went by things too quickly, this is a good opportunity to ask clarifying questions, because you're probably not the only one who got confused. Or you can ask a big picture question.
Okay, well, while you all are thinking, I'm gonna throw out some things. As I was listening to folks talk, a couple of themes that came up was this using research and community connections to actually be able to know what is needed and identify community needs. And then sort of I think everyone has spoken about, like, once that's done, it's not like you can pick the thing from the tree and hand it, but there's a lot of creativity that goes into meeting that need. A lot of different approaches and steps. I really liked the framing of thinking about the whole ecosystem. and thinking about systems change. And I think undergirding the work that everyone talked about are these ideas that Alondra really perfectly summed up as the last speaker. So I think that was perfect. Around power and the ways in which the systems of power and disinvestment are designed to prevent particularly communities of color from having access to resources. And so it takes a lot of contortions and vision and creativity to undo those systems. If no one has questions, I will follow up. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So as I don't know, like who wants to kind of jump in here, it might be more of a comment more than a question, but I would love your others' thoughts on this too. As we listen to communities' desires and needs, I always kind of get stuck because I feel like I feel like in listening to the community and dreaming with the community, we dream about things, but then at the end of the day, I come back and I'm like, well, I don't have, like we don't have resources. I don't have access to those resources. If we're going to work with this funding, we have to build it within this box and hit all these check marks. And so it doesn't always like match up. And so I'm just wondering, Rudy, you kind of got excited about like things are changing, and I hope they don't go back to what the normal was. And I feel that way too. So like, how do we like dream with our community in a way that we're not like over promising things that we can't accomplish or can't do realistically, but also in a place where it's like, no, these things really could be possible, and we're gonna find creative ways. I mean, that's where I feel like we are as a little CDC. Like we're constantly trying to just find creative ways to do things that are outside of the norm of affordable housing or fitting into the box of like, oh, we can only use government funding or this funding, but really just kind of find more creative ways. So I'd love to hear more about others and how you guys have done that, or if you have ideas or insights there.
I can.
Go ahead, Zach, please.
Yeah, it sometimes feels, as a developer of housing, an affordable developer, that you're having to, build the plane and fly it at the same time, so to speak. And I think in the community land trust space specifically, this tension is very real because you deal with folks who, for very good reason, want to be activists in the housing landscape. But in order to be a successful developer, you've got to get community vision to approve the loan, right? And so, it requires that sort of discipline, right, in the finance space and the developer space that oftentimes brushes against the activism spirit that got us here in the first place. And so one of the ways I think that's helpful at this is really focusing on the policy. A lot of times the constraints that make our dreams impossible are rooted in policy. They're rooted in regulation systems. And so really working hand in hand with community to get them to begin to understand those things, which takes time and is complicated. I think it pays off because it then helps to direct and drive where the community advocates. So for example, we had an affordable housing bond passed here in Oakland, $100 million. And the voters' intent was for it to be used for anti-displacement, which we think means preservation. But in the beginning, most of the bond was used to pay down some of the affordable housing LIHTC developments that had gaps. And so we looked at voters' intent and looked at what the bond was actually supposed to be used for, and we're able to leverage that into the creation of a fund specifically for community land trust. And we believe it's the first dedicated fund in California, the Acquisition and Conversion to Affordable Housing, ACAH fund. And that was $14 million that we were able to create in 2019 of new funding to take down properties that are facing the threat of speculation and eventual displacement. And so I think, although it's complicated and it takes time, really engaging community in policy, and I think taking advantage of the time that we're in now, because it's not enough to just say, oh, the funding isn't there, oh, the systems don't work. You actually have to actively create the alternative for people to visualize, because that inspiration helps people to keep going.
Yeah, I guess thank you. I'm so happy you went first, sir, because you cue me up perfectly for what I was going to share. So Esther, like I think that when we invest in community and like in building up leaders, I think it's a long game and it takes years and years. And it requires a lot of reminding of this is how the system works and managing expectations. But I think that it's all worth it and it prepares us for the opportunities that are in front of us. And so from a funding standpoint, I think it's really important for all of us to be aware of the different types of funding and where they come from. I know there's a question here from Dylan about where does the majority of philanthropic support come from? You know, as a nonprofit, oftentimes we focus on foundations and philanthropy. You know, it's like, oh, I hope Chan Zuckerberg cuts me a check for this, and like that's all my eggs are in that basket. We should definitely focus on those funders, but there's also a lot of public resources that we can redirect. So I've been super inspired. For example, one of the other inspirations is the defund the police efforts, because it's been a dialogue, a public discourse about where does our public money go? In Los Angeles, over 55% of our budget goes to police, and every other department was getting cut except for that department. Just taking the politics aside, it really begged a discussion about, you know, how are we managing all the resources, and can we propose new ideas to direct money in other ways? So one concrete example, to Zach's point of being ready and providing concrete ideas, we've been struggling to help street vendors participate in the formal economy. Some of our elected leaders wanted to criminalize them, give them misdemeanor citations, wanted to pen some vendors up in parking lots. And because of the investment that we did in community, we had a lot of alternative ideas. Recently, we got an opportunity with County Supervisor Hilda Solis, whose office said, "What do you got? If you don't want this to happen, what are you proposing?" And so because we had invested in community engagement, we were able to turn around some of these ideas in 24 hours and presented a concrete plan that 3 weeks ago, they said, you know what, this sounds good, let's go ahead and move forward. And they allocated $1 million to begin to develop a prototype affordable street cart for vendors. It's the beginning, it's the first step, you know? But I guess that the key thing that I wanted to share, that for us, it was important to invest in community engagement, but also be ready to have some very concrete, tangible things to present to the elected leaders, because they're also desperate for ideas, team. They're getting feedback from everybody under the sun, and they are also looking for solutions. And so if we're helping them a little bit, helping them to do their job a tad bit, I mean, I think sometimes you could find some shared value there, you know.
Thank you, Rudy. So there's a couple other questions in the chat. And what you said just made me think of conversation Alice and I had a few months ago with a former city council member who was like, a budget is policy. And looking at the budget gives you a sense of the policy priorities. And if you want to shift them, that's a good place to start. So this question around the majority of philanthropic support came up, how you get buy-in from elected officials. And then the last question here is, have you all worked on strategies on how community members understand housing programs and how the processes can change for the future? So education and outreach. So we have politics, money, education, and outreach. And I'll let any of you jump in where you want.
I think I can speak a little bit to the education and outreach piece. And I think this is like linked to the conversation that was posed by the first question about, you know, this tension between now and what's possible. And I think like that question really resonated with me, because I think that that's a place where Lift to Rise has been challenged, because we are kind of, I think everyone has to balance the urgency of what needs to happen now with what we can imagine to be possible. And to be honest, the way that we've mitigated that is just by being real with folks, right? Like you have to bring community with you. There is a piece of education, not just for community members, but for internal partners as well. So within the work of Live to Rise, we kind of hold what we call multi-layer resident leadership strategy. And really what that means is recognizing that our strategy for community engagement has to just work on multiple layers. So working with residents, working with partners, building their capacity so that their spaces are inclusive of all residents, making sure that our spaces are inclusive of all residents, so that when you're talking about something like LIHTC and you're talking about how a project gets financed and someone doesn't understand, why that has to do with them. At the end of the day, they just want options for their housing, right? There's work to be done on multiple ends. And so the work that Live to Rise does is, one, building out our internal capacity, but two, building out a resident leadership table that has representation across all of the work that we hold. And so there's ownership of the work, but there's also a shared understanding among all partners involved of kind of the baseline as to where we're at and what we're trying to imagine that is possible. So I agree with everything that has been said around this piece. It does take time, but you got to stick to it. You got to build the community trust to really, if your intention is to realize community priorities, that's the work that you have to do. And it's a long game.
And I would also touch on, I think there's a question about how do you talk to your county supervisors if they're not progressive. Many politicians are swayed by the numbers. So at this point, if you know that you're going to get pushback with your local politicians or your local government, then the best way to sway them in your favor would be to get community engagement. When you begin to collectively, amass, people on one cause. I mean, think about why all of a sudden a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement has now moved to the forefront. It didn't move to the forefront previously when we first started like moving, a couple of years ago. It was met with a whole bunch of opposition, and that was squashed. The minute that you got a whole bunch of people seeing this video of a man being murdered in the street, then you have public outrage, then you have a movement, and now all of a sudden all the politicians are moving in that same direction. That is a very dramatic example of what, I guess what people would say, the squeaky wheel gets the oil. So if you're trying to do policy change, you need to, and that it's the right, or that it would be a benefit to your community, you need to talk to your community, and you need to get your community members to show up at the city council meetings. You need to get them to write their local council members. You need to, bring these people together, because there really is safety in numbers, and that is how policy is changed. It's the majority rules. So if the politicians see that the people are all in agreement on one thing, guess what will happen? They will shift because they want to get reelected or whatever the case may be. But typically what they're really supposed to be there is to represent the voice of the people. If the voice of the people is two people, they're going to be like, well, that's not enough people to really sway me one way or the other. So you need to really get buy-in from your community and make it, try to get them to understand the importance of showing up. Some people shy away from that type of engagement for whatever reason. We have a lot of different reasons, but if we really want to get some type of change, we need to come together and move people into those spaces where they can be heard and learn how to amplify their voices. When it comes to access to resources, even for a CDFI like the one that I work for, like Community Vision, it wasn't until this situation happened, we didn't do micro lending. We didn't do lending for small businesses, and we didn't really look into see how we could make that happen until this major crisis came up. And then now we have to change our lending practices because one thing that we are dedicated to is making our lending practices more equitable across the board. So once all this stuff happened and people were like, well, you can't, do this with this pot of money because there are these parameters on that, we went back to our lenders or the people who were giving to our organization, had a conversation with them, And because the need was so great, we were able to convince them to kind of change some of the parameters. So it's about communication, it's about unity, it's about bringing people together for a specific cause to make change.
You know, I also like in the work that the advocacy work, sometimes I like to, one of my former bosses, you know, used to call it like Tai Chi, you know, just like let the energy go. So if we're encountering someone that is totally in opposition of our ideas, you know, I just let it, I was like, okay, it's fine. You know, there may not be an opportunity for us to persuade them, but they may be an ally in another aspect of the work, you know. There are some conservative council members or supervisors here locally that don't really care about street vendors. They don't care about working class people. You know, they don't care about immigrants per se. It's like not their thing. Sometimes they vocally have said, that's just not my thing. I'm not going to do it. So sometimes I'm really grateful for the clarity. Thank you so much for sharing that. And then, but they're really interested in other things. They might be interested in commercial real estate. They may be interested in like increasing the tax base. And so really doing a really thorough power mapping of like who cares about these certain issues and how do we work with them on those things. I think that that's great. Everybody has a role to play, you know, even conservative people, quote unquote.
On that note, I wanted to give Thomas a chance to weigh in before we go into our breakout groups, which I think is relevant to what Rudy just said.
Thanks. This has been really great questions and great conversation. I thought I'd just respond in general to some of the themes that have come up, and just to say that, you know, I'm a big believer in what some people call like big tent collaboration, what other people call inside outside strategies, because the kinds of systems change or changing from an underinvested ecosystem to one which is bringing in investment towards community priorities, it's a really messy business. And there's a million reasons to say no to ideas. And the more voices that you have at the table, the more you can overcome sort of the tendency to, you know, of expertise. In one way to look at it is we become really experts in the thing that we do, and it's one thing or it's 5 things, and then everything else that doesn't fit into those few boxes, it's like, well, I can't do it. There's no system to do that. But you need it, you know, the more you can get people who's has a different box that they, you know, that they work with, you know, you might find somebody that doesn't say, well, that can't be done because there's no system for that. So there's a whole sort of accelerating of the learning cycle that I think is really important for like the systems change and the collaborative processes that are needed for this. The second is also that I think that there's this interaction between the pressures on the system that I think are really important for community organizing to be, working with community residents and elevating priorities and pressure. And when somebody says, no, that can't be done, it's important for the pressure to be saying, well, I'm not going to take no for an answer. And not everybody at the table is going to be able to have that stance. And so, you know, I would say, you know, the more that you can, you know, informally or formally create those channels for collaboratives for people to come together, the more you can create like big learning loops, little learning loops, you know, the points to overcome these barriers, because, you know, this is like a generative creative process is one of the themes I was hearing. And that comes from not individuals, it comes from, you know, people working together. And, you know, the more you can, I would say the more you find yourselves in rooms where you know everybody, you're probably not going in the right direction. The more you find yourself in rooms where it's like, oh, I don't actually know a lot of these people, that's probably you're going in the right direction, because then you're servicing, you know, new possibilities that you might not have otherwise. Not to say that like you don't go to and create the rooms where you know everybody, because those rooms are important too. But you know, that can't be the only rooms that you create for yourself, ourselves.
Thank you, Thomas. I saw a lot of heads nodding. So I think that that is a great note to move into